I'm John Borthwick, and tonight we're going to talk about the intersection of AI and podcasting. I'm delighted to have two guests with me here tonight. First, we have Caleb, who is from the Next Big Idea Club. He's a co-host and a co-founder of the Next Big Idea Club. I asked him to join the panel because I know that the Next Big Idea Club team have been thinking about AI and the integration of AI for quite a while. And I also wanted somebody on the panel who could take the role of the publisher or the podcast producer. I'm going to be on the other side where I'm going to moderate the conversation, but I'm also coming to this as the sort of with the user's hat on. I've been a user of the Snipd app for, I think, about a year and a half. And about a month ago, I reached out to Kevin on what used to be called Twitter, now is X. I'm always trying to correct myself because I think I'm nostalgic for what was. And so I reached out to Kevin on X and said, hey, I'd love to chat with you. We jumped on Zoom, and then he said he was going to be in New York with his wife, and that his wife was okay for him to do this for the evening. So hopefully we won't keep him for the whole evening, but it's my delight to have Kevin here. So I'm going to invite Kevin and Caleb up. For fun and for full transparency, I'm also going to run a AI recording of this. So I'm just going to leave this because I'm kind of interested in seeing what that comes back with. And if anybody wants it afterwards, it's an app, one of our apps called Granola. And so it's going to sort of give me a summary of the discussion that we're going to have tonight. And so why don't we start with quick introductions? So Caleb, do you want to start out?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Caleb. Joe Rogan couldn't make it. So I'm playing the role of podcast producer tonight. I'm the exec producer and co-host of The Next Big Idea, a show that was sort of born in this room. Before that, I was a longtime producer at Wondery, where I made a lot of true crime shows, chatcasts, sports, documentary, everything. Too many things, in fact. I'm really looking forward to this, and I think Kevin is going to do a demo of Snipd, which is just an absolutely tremendous app. So let's see this demo, and then we'll have a chat.
Great. Yeah. Hi, I'm Kevin. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Snipd. Maybe a bit about myself first before I dive right into the app. My background is a bit like, I think now 10 years ago, I got into machine learning. And it fascinated me so much that I quit my job at a big bank and joined an early stage startup such that I could do machine learning 24/7. But that was actually also the moment when I realized, okay, I have actually no idea about the startup world. So the founder at the time recommended this podcast called How to Start a Startup by Sam Altman, back when he was not yet at OpenAI. And there I was in Zurich, so I'm actually based in Switzerland, so on the other side of the planet, listening to some of the greatest entrepreneurs that we've seen in the last 20 years, giving me all of their advice while I'm riding my bike to work, so I'm not even losing any time. And that was really the moment when I realized how podcasts are one of the largest knowledge sources in the world. Really started listening to podcasts to learn. But that was also the moment when I ran into more and more issues where I thought, hey, this could be done better, especially with my background in AI. And that was the initial spark for creating Snipd.
So before you do the demo, a few questions. So when did you launch? When did Snipd launch?
So the first version we released, I think around 3.5 years ago, actually already. It was very, very basic.
Talk to me just for a minute, because I'd like to help frame this for people. Like when you and I talked, one of the things which was interesting is you said to me, a lot of the history of podcasting apps comes from RSS and feed-based structures, and then I guess also an influence on the music side, playlists and so on. And you decided very clearly to think about Snipd differently because you think about podcasts as sort of knowledge graphs. So just talk a little bit about that for a second, because I think as people have seen it, it's useful to frame it.
Yeah, I think you've said most of it already. But no, yeah. So for us, it all goes. So not just me, but the whole Snipd team. It all goes back to we look at podcasts as one of the largest knowledge sources in the world, especially a knowledge source that is highly underutilized. And we look at podcast apps today as basically repurposed music players. You know, this format came along, podcast, and we had this concept of a music player. You know, you press play, you press pause, that's it. And so we just used that, and that made sense. But as soon as you start looking at podcasts as knowledge, as a knowledge library, and you want to engage with that, you want to consume it, but then you also want to do something with it later on. You want to combine information, apply it to your life, share it with others. Then suddenly it becomes quite inadequate to just use a music player to engage with this knowledge library. And especially AI is basically the enabling technology where you can now say, hey, it doesn't have to be that way. It was just like that because we didn't have better tools, and now we have it. So let's create a new interaction paradigm.
Let's see it.
Cool. So, demo is always very dangerous.
There we go. Cool.
So I think today most of our users. So actually, I'm going to give you two separate definitions of what Snipd is. I'll give you the simple definition and then a bit of a more nuanced one, which I think will help for a lot of what we're going to talk about next. The simple definition today is we're basically an AI-powered podcast app. So we took the concept of a podcast app and brought it into the AI era. So to give you a bit of an example, so here these are the shows that I'm subscribed to. Here are the latest episodes. So maybe I'll just jump into one of these episodes. This is an episode of the Diary of a CEO podcast. One of the things you can notice here, we generate these, what we call a sneak peek of the episode. So this is AI generated. In this conversation with Eva, a former Secret Service agent and author of Becoming Bulletproof, shares insights from her intense training in human behavior and lie detection, etc., etc. We also identify who the guest is. So this is also AI identifying the name, finding a picture of her online, creating a mini bio. So the mini bio is a former Secret Service agent and author of the book Becoming Bulletproof. She's an expert in human behavior and communication. You can also see what other episodes she's been on, even see similar guests if I want to discover more. We then generate small, brief overview summaries of the episode to give you a bit of a better understanding of what the episode is really about before diving in. You can see which books get recommended. And then we break the episode down into chapters. So all of these chapters are AI generated. We even have some quotes that we extract. And most of this is really geared towards helping you decide whether or not to actually consume this episode. Now let's say we actually jump into an episode. So here's an episode that maybe some of you have come across, the Microsoft CEO on Dwakesh podcast, relatively recent episode. What we have here is also the transcript, of course. You can search within the transcript, and you can, wait, actually, let me play this episode. You also have the ability to chat with an episode. So this is an AI, as similar as ChatGPT, which has access to the entire content of the episode. So you can, for example, ask things like, when do they talk about let's see whether this works. So when do they actually talk about this lie detection stuff? And here now I have the timestamp at which they start talking about this. So yeah, this is sort of the simple definition of Snipd. And now I give you a little bit more nuanced one, which goes back to what you were referring to, John. Like for us, what we are actually trying to do is we want to be the spoken audio platform for people who listen to learn. So if your motivation, like my personal motivation, I told it earlier, is I want to learn from all of these smart people. And we want to, with our app, make that 10 times more effective for you to do. So beyond the features that I now showed you, actually the most popular and most impactful feature that we have is the so-called snipping, where also our name comes from. So whenever you hear an amazing insight that you want to remember or share with someone, you can just triple tap your headphones or click this big button here, create snip, and our AI summarizes the insight that you just heard and saves that in your knowledge library together with the original transcript and audio. So here, this is, the insight is the real benchmark for AGI is not some self-proclaimed milestone or benchmark hacking. The real benchmark is 10% economic growth. And we also extract a quote. And this is now saved in my snips library, where I can retrieve all of this information again. For example, I can go to an episode I recently listened to with Toby Lütke. You can see like the most important insights that I took away from this episode. I can also see the books that got recommended, or also just ask again the chat for certain information. So one thing that I remember was there was something about Toby, the founder of Shopify, being sometimes like Turbo Toby or something. So I can just ask, what was that again? Let's see what happens. It was Toby Tornado, yeah. Yeah, it refers to his rapid decision making and change management. So I can maybe now also say, create a note for me. So now basically creates this note for me on this Tornado Toby. And I can now share this with, for example, John, be like, hey, we need a Tornado John. Or just save it in my library. Yeah, and maybe final one to show here, these snips that are created. You can share them with others. That's, I think, one of these also natural things that are missing in this spoken audio content world, where you come across an amazing insight, you do want to share it with someone, you want to share it with your team, and it's so difficult. You know, you can only share the entire episode, and you share this podcast, and then the next day or next week, you ask them like, hey, did you listen to it? And of course they didn't listen to it because it's a 2-hour conversation, even though they're your best friends or wife. So for example, here I have an example that John sent me earlier, a snip that he sent me about the majority illusion, and he can now send this to me. I can see the notes, I can see the quote, I can even see the book that got mentioned in this moment, together with the context in which it was mentioned. So it was mentioned by Bill as a book that was popular among conservatives in the early 19th century. Yeah, or I can listen to this exact moment again and dive into the full episode.
I want to start by talking about sort of where we are today. So this is, I think, is sort of state of the art of where the intersection of podcasting and AI sits today. And just, I would characterize the first set of things that you showed us, Kevin, to be sort of in the discovery zone. Sort of like you're hitting your podcast app and you want to discover stuff. And then the second is sort of in the think, learn, remember kind of zone. And so let's talk about those individually, and then we're going to talk, and then we'll go further because I want to start digging into sort of where this stuff is going and synthetic media and synthetic characters and just being able to talk back to podcasts, to be able to yell at Joe Rogan like you've always wanted to. So starting with discovery, well, just some metrics from you. You know, how much time do people spend in sort of discover mode on the app? Is it like a meaningful amount of time? Is it or not?
Ooh, to be honest, I can't really tell you right now, but of course, most of the time in the app is spent in moments in your life where you're doing something with your eyes, but not your brain. This is in general always, we actually see ourselves as the app like for those moments. So often the discovery part is just a means to an end to get to content as quickly as possible, such that you can consume and do that while you're doing something else. And given that discovery today is happening not in an audio format, it's usually just like let's get there as quickly as possible. So it's not that they're spending too much time in this discovery mode.
Got it. And Caleb, from the production side, how much do you think about you have this huge library of previous episodes? Like when you create a new episode, and you just did one with Reid Hoffman, and he makes a reference back to his days at LinkedIn, or he makes a reference about OpenAI, and you've got an older episode with Sam Altman. How much work do you put for show notes? Do people actually ever use the show notes? Does it uniformly make it through to most podcast apps? How do you think about that?
Yeah, I'm not convinced that people really read show notes, sadly. And I think the only ways that we have to sort of clue people into that are very, and be sure to check out our other episode in which Cal Newport talks about this thing, in the outro that no one listens to. So I think that's a real pain point, right? That like when you have a considerable content library that effectively, after that sell-by date of like it's 3, 4, 5 episodes down in your feed, it's very hard, I think, to help people, to motivate people to go back to discover it and to figure out the surprising connections between different sets of episodes, right? Like, I have been doing this project. I'm a big fan of this show called The Rest is History, which is these two British guys who talk about history. And I am constantly feeding episodes on different themes into Notebook LM so that I can play off their conversation about the onset of World War I against their conversation about the onset of World War II and themes that overlap and themes that deviate. And like,
so you're using you're using Notebook LM to get two different podcasts to talk to each other.
Exactly.
Interesting. That's really screwed up, but that's interesting.
Yeah. I have too much time on my hand.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I think discovery has like historically been one of the biggest pain points for podcasts.
And what about search? I mean, search is challenging in podcast, right? I mean, I think search on Snipd is pretty good. You break out search by, I can search for a show, or I can search for an episode. But on many podcasting apps, I mean, on the back end, how does search, Caleb, how does he get indexed in Snipd?
Okay, so on the search side, I think there is actually a huge opportunity for us that we haven't tackled yet, that is not live yet. Actually going into what you mentioned, basically this podcast that has, and the rest is history is the name, right? Basically this podcast has created a huge catalog of content and basically in itself a knowledge library. And you as a fan would like to access that. And today you're actually using these other tools, other platforms, Notebook LM, and you need to transcribe it first and do all of this stuff, right? In my opinion, in the future, this should be a native part of a podcast app or spoken audio app, whatever you want to call it. And the content creator should actually be part of this loop. It should be a native part. So basically also thinking about, monetization and all of these schemes, however that might look like, but the creator should be part of that because basically makes what they've already built up, their entire content catalog, much more valuable suddenly, and they can reuse that compared to today, where what you said earlier, once an episode is like 3 episodes down in your feed, no one's ever going to listen to it again. But to come back to your specific question, so what happens is, like, let's say you have a new episode that comes out. Our AI goes through it initially and does all of this processing to create what you saw now. So it's like transcription, it's speaker diarization, understanding who these speakers are, using LLMs to match which speaker block belongs to which person. Going out actually in the internet to find like the mini bio, to find the cover of the book, more information about the books that were recommended. So this is also tying into APIs like Perplexity, if you know that. All of that happens once and is then basically indexed on our side.
Got it. The diarization has gotten much, much better. I mean, it's like 6 months ago that did not work that well. So I'd listen to an episode, and afterwards it would be just speaker 1, speaker 2, speaker 1, speaker 2. And now it does a really good job of actually identifying the speakers.
Yeah, and that is actually also something that the reason why we invested into improving that is basically you can now think, and like this is not live yet, but the way that we're thinking about it is, okay, John here might have been on several podcasts over the last 10 years. And if we know exactly where in these podcasts he was speaking, we can actually, again, have a new sub-knowledge library, which is John, everything that John has said over the last 10 years directly from him. And now you can query that again or engage with that and find out, hey, what has John been saying all this time? So that's why we are investing into this like more low-level indexing, let's say.
Yeah.
Tornado, John. And can you? Is there a social element at all? Like, could I go in and see? I follow John Borthwick, and I can see all the snips that he's snipping. Is there a way to search not just by guest, podcast, etc., but to see people in your social network? Who are they following? What are they snipping? What are they liking?
So this is actually a feature that we had in the app, and we had it live. We deprioritized it for now. It's more of a product decision because, like I already showed you a lot, and this whole entire social graph on top is another, adds a lot of complexity. But the way that we think about it in the future is actually, it always goes back to, it's very natural for you. Like if you come across something that is valuable, insightful, you do want to share that. You want to share it with your team, with your friends. And that's something that we're very interested in improving in the future again.
I mean, we, years ago at Betaworks, we backed a social podcasting app, which is called Breaker. And, I believed in the early days of podcasting, this was before we even backed Anchor, so it was a long time ago. But I believed that there was the social that discovery was a huge problem and that most people did it socially. And Breaker had an architecture where I could follow Kevin, I could follow Caleb, and I could see what you were listening to. It didn't work. And I think that there were a handful of reasons I concluded from that. One of it, which is that yes, podcasts are transmitted socially, but the atomic level is usually the discussion of you're like, oh, the rest of his history is great. And I'm like, yeah, but, and then you're like, well, there's a really good episode on First World War. And I'm like, okay, tell me about that, right? And then I go listen to that episode. So the atomic unit is either the episode, or it is even beneath that, it's the chunk, like Kevin was showing you, where there's a discussion, with Toby about turbo, blah, blah, blah. So it's like that, it's that sort of, it's the thought. So it's not really the overall, feed, which is, so I think the social, where does the social interaction live? Because if you think about it, right, the thought element ends up in X or in one of the social media, because people then go there and share it and say, hey, I listened to this and this really interesting idea came out. So it's like, what's the atomic unit that you really want to share socially? And I think it's closer to the idea blob than even the episode or the feed. So that's interesting. So let's start drifting into sort of where this is going. So, Caleb, you have this huge library, and I happen to know that there are some dead people that you would love to interview at Next Big Idea. So talk about that a little bit and how you think about that, because
Yeah, this is a conversation my wife and I were having last night, and I was saying, I was bemoaning the fact that Danny Kahneman, the great sort of legendary economist, psychologist, has always been on the long list for us, of someone, short list really, of someone we wanted to talk to. We just never figured it out, and he is now dead. And I was saying to my wife, wow, what if we could, talk to the Kahneman estate, and we could get all of his writing and all of the interviews he's ever done, and we could clone his voice, and we could interview Danny Kahneman. And she said, oh my God, that sounds really creepy. Which I think is still a pain point in figuring out how we move forward with what sort of synthetically generated content looks like. There is the ick factor. But I think it's also thrilling, right? This idea that you're able to, for lack of a better word, exhume ideas, and you're able to find new mechanisms through which to converse with thinkers and artists and writers and knowledge from the past in a contemporary setting. I think there's an opportunity there. I think it's sort of scary and thrilling at the same time.
Yeah. What do you think, Kevin?
I think it's a huge opportunity with respect to the weirdness of it. I completely agree, but I see it a bit similar to, society gets used to these kind of things very quickly, as long as this technology is applied in a positive way. One thing that comes to mind is, these societal norms. Before we had cell phones, and then the first cell phones came along, and then people saw other people talking to this device on the street, and they thought it was weird. And we got over that. And then AirPods came along, and people started talking with AirPods in their ears, which was just this small thing, and people said, that's weird, and now we're used to that. And the same way, it will continue. The next thing will be smart glasses that you will talk to, and people will say it's weird. And for me, that's another case where, talking to someone who has died already is weird, but it will become normal. And maybe we won't start with these cases. For me, it's not just about talking to people who are dead, but for me, it's about accessing a certain. Again, I always think in knowledge libraries, right? And a certain subset of knowledge, right? So that might be Daniel Kahneman. It might be your entire podcast, because basically with your podcast, you have curated a certain set of knowledge with a certain intent. Almost all successful podcasts have that. And for me to go into and tap into this and communicate with this, speak with this knowledge library, I find super exciting.
So do you think you start speaking to it? Because right now you're clicking, right? You're pulling up your screen and clicking to it. At what point do you start interrupting the podcast and talking to it?
Yeah, so this is in general a field that we're very excited about, voice as an interface. It's something that I believe only recently has really become possible with the latest advancements in AI. Maybe I can give a bit of background to why I am excited about this, because the simple version is a bit like, oh yeah, we now have this technology and we have podcasts, so of course we will talk to it. But for me, it actually goes a bit more deeper. So again, for us, our goal is to help you learn more effectively from the spoken audio content. And there are actually a lot of features that we are thinking about that we know will help you take away much more from an episode. So one example is actually reflecting upon what you've listened to. We're so used to just consuming. The podcast episode is over. Immediately the next one switches on, and you've already forgotten what the last one was about. And we, of course, now have these snips, right? But it helps if you actually go back and force yourself to engage with it. So, for example, one thing that I try to do is for every episode that I listen to, I try to come up with one single most important takeaway that I will take away from me, for myself. And this is sort of a forcing function that forces me to actively think about what I've listened to, because there were probably 10 things that I liked, but choosing one is this active process. Now, in the past, this is something that we as an app, we have to trigger the user to do this at some point in their life. And if it's not happening in audio, at some point you will get a push notification from us, and it will be like, hey, open up Snipd and do this. So there's actually no natural trigger in your life to do this, which is then always very difficult to build a habit around it. There's basically only one successful, like super successful app that has successfully done this, which is Duolingo. And like they've gamified the shit out of this. But this is then the only path, right? However, now if you have voice as an interface, what we can actually do is, let's say you finish an episode, and actually now your AI companion can come on automatically, and you can have a quick 2, 3, 4 minute conversation about, hey, what were actually the most important takeaways for you? And really boil down to, okay, here's one key takeaway for me, have a bit of a back and forth, reflect upon it, and then move on to the next moment. And this is now, we don't need to send you a push notification. You don't need to have your streak that once it breaks, an owl is going to come and kidnap you. It can just happen in the flow, continue. And just this product aspect of it, I find very, very exciting.
And so do you imagine that will there be like a single host, an audio host for all of Snipd? Will there be an owl? Will there be like, or is it for each, like, will Caleb and Next Big Idea Club come to you and sort of say, this is how we want to personify our agent or avatar? Or how do you think about it?
Yeah.
And this is all, I know you're just making it up, so.
Yeah, so this depends a bit on like what aspect you're talking about in the app. This now goes into quite the details, but I think this whole concept of, in general, I believe all of the apps in the future will become like your best friend. I think this is just the future, and we will be, I see Snipd very similar there. Snipd will know you very well, will know what your goals are, and will help you achieve those things. And this aspect, this kind of AI companion, I see as us designing this, but personalized for the user. But then there's this other aspect of what you also mentioned with talking, speaking with a podcast, speaking with like an entire podcast corpus. For example, the Big Ideas podcast, and that's where we're actually super excited to engage with creators and create something together. Where the Big Ideas podcast has you called it AI host. It's an AI Caleb, or it's an AI owl, and yeah, we design that together, or you are the leading creative director there, and it's then offered to users, but it's like a separate thing.
Yeah, because you could imagine, given the archive that you have, I mean, at any individual, rest is history. Let's point to that because it's an easy one, right? A lot of history, a lot of podcasts, that they could train a AI on that entire archive, and then be able to instead of having the First World War episode, you could just have a episode about, conflict in Europe, and it would cut across like 15 different, episodes and clip them together and create something. Interesting for you, Caleb, or what? How do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that idea of supercutting is sort of cool. I think there's an interesting question that comes up for me, which is like the process that you were describing is exciting. It's also quite a lot of work for listener, right? Like you have to be the kind of person who wants to be, podcasting is sometimes described as like this great lean back medium, right? That like you're sort of paying attention, but you're also doing the dishes and you're also thinking about something that happened at work today. And the kind of engagement that you're talking about is very active, And I wonder, like, I don't know. There's also this part of me that like thinks the pleasure of podcasting is to lean back. That like it's sometimes that audio is not a medium of information; it's a medium of emotions. And I think that's true for some shows and not true for others. But like I think there's a tension here between sort of entertainment and information. And I think it's interesting to think about like. I totally see the user for whom there is incredible appetite to be able to extract knowledge from a podcast in the way that you're describing. I can also see the user for whom there's incredible appetite to really circumvent the podcast entirely. Like, I don't actually want to listen to this. I want to see what it's about. I want to see the highlights. I want to ask a couple of questions in the transcript, and then I want to move on. But I'd be curious to hear you talk about sort of the like entertainment aspect. Like, I would be curious to know, like, as people listen to something in Snipd, do you see the number of snips like go down as the podcast episode goes on because they're just starting to lean back and because they're starting to just let it wash over them and they are no longer in the mode of like knowledge extraction, but are more in the mode of like, oh my God, this is entertaining?
So the answer is no. We don't see that. We don't see that trend. But it is very true. Like. The beauty of podcasts is not just that it's pure information, right? It's not a lecture. Maybe some Huberman episodes might feel like that.
Good God.
But no, that is exactly the beauty of it, right? It is entertaining. It is often a conversation between two people. So I don't see that going away. When we talk about like that, we're so focused on knowledge. It's basically we are trying to separate us from. We are not building a product for true crime podcasts or storytelling or to listen to the Harry Potter book. But entertainment is an important aspect in all of this, yeah.
Okay, from synthetic characters, let's talk about slop for a minute. So, there's one of the characteristics or one of the aspects of the sort of the new world we're entering is the cost of production of things that sound like real podcasts has just gone to zero, right? So a friend of mine who runs a podcast, he sent me a podcast late last year where there was 60 episodes that are being created in like 48 hours. And sure enough, I listened to the beginning of them, and there was a little intro at the beginning which said, and, Jane and Bob are now going to, and then it went right into Notebook LLMs voices. And I was like, Jane and Bob, I never knew you had names, But it was just pure slop. And how do you think about that? And how do you think about the sort of the slopification, if that's a word, of the podosphere, if that's a word, because it feels like it's going to come, right? We've seen that. I mean, it's like spam, and it's like just with the cost of production going to zero, you can imagine that so much crappy, stuff is going to be produced, and that makes it harder to find good content, makes it harder to enjoy podcasting.
Yeah, well, there certainly is already a lot of crap being produced even before AI. And I actually think AI is already creating a slop problem. We were interviewing this guy named Will Storr the other day, who's a wonderful sort of British science journalist. And he sent me a copy of his book, and he said, please don't feed this into any AI models. And I said, okay. And he said, because I was recently on a podcast, and I won't name names, but a very famous podcast, huge show. And he said, we're having a nice chat. And then the host says, so Will, when you wrote Moneyball and you embedded with the Oakland A's, and Will said, I think you're referring to Michael Lewis's book, Moneyball. And the host goes, oh, sorry, AI sometimes hallucinates when it writes questions for me. Like this is a huge show. And so I think slop is actually already a problem. I think AI slop is already infiltrating podcasting because I think producers are leaning on AI more and more and more to generate questions, to help them with content. So I think it's already an issue. But yeah, it gets turbocharged when you bring in the synthetic voices, So I think it is worrying,
So the way that I see it is that not much will change, because I see it a bit like you, already today there is a lot of low quality content out there. I mean, it's very, very easy to create a podcast. So it doesn't really change from that perspective. At the end of the day, I still envision a future of podcasts where you have let's say a host or a production company that has a certain brand. So if the Big Ideas podcast releases an episode, I have a certain trust that I've built up with you, that this podcast is good, right? And that is also why I think it's so interesting to think of, again, when we talk about accessing knowledge, right? Like and talking to podcasts and all of this. One thing that you haven't mentioned, but I sometimes hear is like, why don't I just go to ChatGPT? It has everything. It has access to everything, or Perplexity. But I personally am seeing that there is value of knowing, okay, this is now from the Big Ideas podcast. This is now Lenny's podcast, that the information that he has personally curated. So I believe that there's value there, and that is basically this brand that you build up by creating and continuing to create valuable content in the future. But we will always live in a future. We will always live in a world where, on the internet in general, there is just a lot of crap.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I appreciate Snip for is that it gives me a little bit of signal when I'm looking at the feed. I can see how many snips were made of a particular podcast. I mean, I think generally, to Caleb's point before, I would say that there are pure entertainment, lean-back podcasts, which I'll look at, and people are not snipping. I don't think like great podcasts like Serial or like great, like storytelling podcasts, I'm going to want to like snip in the same way. I'm just going to be like lean back and enjoy. And if you look at the most snip things on Snipd, they're typically in the sort of like people are learning stuff. It's a lot of Huberman. It's a lot of like kind of things that you do at Next Big Idea.
One thing that I'd love to add there is, or maybe actually two even. With AI-generated content, I think one area that is very interesting is if content is created personalized to you, so personally to you. So one field that I do believe will be a big field in the future is basically you take what OpenAI Deep Research is, if anyone has tried that out, and you combine that with Notebook LM's ability to generate synthetic podcasts. And actually come in and say, hey, I want to learn about this, I want to learn about that. Please create me an overview for 30 minutes. That's my drive to work. And this is now something that is personally created for you. And you just need to trust us or whoever, whatever app generates that content will be great. And that sort of circumvents the whole problem of, is this, this doesn't have to be publicly available to everyone. This is just personally to you.
Right. I see some questions already. You want to start in the back there?
Hello. Thanks so much. I'm a big fan of the app. In terms of the lean back, lean in stuff, you talked about it mostly in terms of like an individual user leaning back and collecting a bunch of stuff and then doing like ladder, synthesis analysis, learning, et cetera, right? But I'm kind of curious to push on the other use case would be someone comes and doesn't do the lean back, right? And how much you're able to, now that you have a library of, personal improvement podcasts with thousands of snips, I can go in there and say I want to listen to, the TIA podcast on, kind of hit the main points and feel pretty like confident that I'm going to get interesting stuff. Do you think that, does it still have its appeal? Like, we talked a little bit about the synthetic part, but, you basically have like the real voice and then the little robot, transition, but like you basically, between the segments, but you're basically not trying to stay grounded in the, the origin doc that distilled it. And I'm just curious, what are you learning there? Like, is it working? Does that appeal to people? Or do you kind of feel like, it goes back to the people who want to listen to a 3-hour thing and start from scratch?
Yeah, so there, I believe what we were talking about earlier is not really something that we have in the app right now. I think what you are referring to is really listening to these very short snips, which is usually like a 2-minute clip. And there, that is not something that, like people are not listening to snips for like 2 hours at a go. Because that has a lot to do with audio. Like basically, 2 minutes is such a short time for you to understand, okay, what are they actually talking about? What's going on here? Is this something that I'm actually interested in? Until you figure that out, you're like 60 seconds in. And once you're then, 1.5 minutes in and you find it interesting, then you actually want to continue. So this format of the snips is not optimal for like consumption of a lot of this. But where I see more potential is basically, you mentioned Peter Attia, him and us working together and actually creating something dedicated for listening, where you can come in and say, okay, I really want to get to the bottom of VO2 max. And now we create something, and not just with a robot voice, but actually it's Peter Attia's voice. And it's not 2-minute clips, but it's really, okay, here's a 15-minute segment, and puts these together from his entire content. And that's something that we in such a format do not have live in the app, or have experimented with.
So, go ahead.
In a past project, I worked with, I guess, similar space to what you're working in, but with literary and just written content. My experience with this has been that there's generally some hesitancy around summarizing someone else's work without essentially talking to them, because the author or the creator will worry about misrepresenting the content they put up there. Have you had interactions with creators around this kind of thing? And if so, what is the interaction been with them?
Yeah, so in general, we've been always, let's say, cautious to like walk that line cautiously to basically, okay, provide as much value to the user as possible while not going too far to upset the creators. And so far, we've managed to do that. We have great relationships with creators. I think as soon as you actually start using our application, you realize that we have not built anything that is there to replace the content. Like earlier you saw, we do have summaries, but if you like just use it yourself as a user, you will realize like, no, this is not taking away from the amount of podcasts that you listen to. It really helps you to understand which podcasts do I want to listen to, what not. Maybe there's an episode every now and then, right, that you wouldn't have listened to at all. You go through the summary a bit, but it's really not taking the podcast away. However, we do have various features that we know our users would love, but we haven't rolled them out because of this. And I think we're now at sort of a crossroads where like it's just going to be normal in the future that you can summarize anything. It will actually also be normal, and this is true for the entire web. It will be normal that you could, for example, skip ads automatically. I mean, this is, for example, a feature we could have built a long time ago. We know exactly where the ads are. We do not have an ad skipper. Users ask for this, but we haven't implemented this, right? But in general, if you look at the internet in general, I think this whole paradigm that has existed in the past, where this unwritten agreement that you can create valuable content, but then you can monetize it, usually via ads. This is currently being broken. And this is not just podcasts, right? So I think going forward, we will have to have a conversation about this. And for us, this means we are very interested in engaging with creators and actually getting them on board and creating new experiences where they are part of the ecosystem, right? Like if people are just consuming a lot of key takeaways, then yeah, they should be monetized. Or if they just talk to an episode, they should be monetized. Yeah, so this is a topic for us in the future, but so far, I think we've walked that line carefully and well.
Wait, so what are the other features that users are desperate for that you're not yet delivering?
You will have to wait and see. But I mean, maybe one obvious one. So for example, I showed the chat with episode. The chat with episode is only available if you listen to the episode or if you have already listened to the episode. All of our users want to be able to chat with the episode before you listen, but we haven't done that, for example. Let's see what happens in the future.
Let's see his question in front here.
Thank you. You mentioned Duolingo being one of the only, major consumer apps that's successfully, commercialized something called spaced repetition, although you didn't use that term. I'm curious, Duolingo is essentially just a series of little exercises and quizzes that have like yes or no answers, right? There's a correct answer or incorrect answer. Have you all thought about like essentially creating spaced repetition quizzes from podcasts and explicitly testing users whether they remember stuff or not?
Yeah, so we do have a feature called Daily Review, which I didn't show you. It's not quiz-based, but it's basically a spaced repetition of these insights that you snip. We resurface them. You can also have a small widget on your home screen where you can see them pop up to resurface these things. I think what you're saying with like a quiz or something like that could be a feature in the future. Today, a lot of our users, so all of the snips that you have, you can sync them with your Notes app. You can sync them with products like Readwise, if you've heard of that, which has spaced repetition and these kind of features. So that's how our users do it today. But if in the future you have an AI companion that just comes on at the end of an episode, you will also just be able to tell it like, hey, please quiz me on some of the stuff on this topic, and it will just do it.
Other questions? Kamika, you have a mic.
So we live in an age where there's misinformation aplenty, and it seems like increasing with AI hallucinations and such. I'm wondering about your curation of information such that you can validate what is true versus what is not, even if, I'm thinking of probably just because Netflix released apple cider vinegar, but I'm thinking about Belle Gibson, this Australian woman who, started a company, most popular app, got a book deal, whole pantry, all that kind of thing, and it's all based on lies. And so I'm just wondering what your curation of, fact versus someone's made-up fiction is.
Yeah, as of today, we basically rely on, we don't do our own fact checking, but basically it's important for us to communicate where did this information come from. So any kind of snip that you might see, it's always, okay, this is from this episode. This is from this podcast. So currently we do not go beyond that. One of the features that we do have like in the back of our minds that we might introduce one day is the ability for you to use AI to fact check what you're hearing. Is of course a very difficult topic, let's put it like that. The way that I actually see it is more, in the future you'll be able to, again, ask an AI companion on, okay, can you give me more information on this? Can you research this? What are other people saying about this? Give me a different view. And then I'll leave it up to you to make up your mind.
And then, but what about also the podcast getting onto Snipd?
So the podcast, as podcast works today, and hopefully also will continue to work in the future, podcast is actually an open ecosystem where you can compare it to the open web. So basically a podcast is like a website, and you can look at Snipd like a browser. So it's actually not that we, like the same way as the Safari browser doesn't curate or decide which websites are allowed to exist, it's the same for us. And we are supporters of this open ecosystem, and I think it's good to keep it that way, even though there are obviously downsides to it.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to the supercutting. So I think what AI, or one of the things that AI is doing, for me at least, is really change the locus of control from the author of a book to the user, who can now ask about what interests him for. And of course, the same for podcasts, from the host and the speaker to, again, the user. So I wonder, because I find it very entertaining as a knowledge library, so I don't see the two mutually exclusive. I wonder if what are you doing in that arena to make it possible for me to say, ask across podcasts, okay, I'm interested in evolutionary biology, particularly how the mind works, give me all the podcasts, et cetera, et cetera. The second thing that I think would be very helpful, I'm a very avid user of your app, is you offer these snippets, right? These snips. Would be fantastic if AI would say at the end of listening to an installment, okay, here are the themes of your snips, right? And then also to do that across all the other podcasts that I read and say, oh, here are the emerging themes. And then an Infranotice is an AI app that I also use, which makes a text analysis, and then looks across all those snips and says, here are some topics that are not yet connected, that are at the periphery. And here are 2 or 3 questions that we have generated with AI that you might want to contemplate. So that would be really fascinating for me.
Yeah, so this is basically a feature that we're very much thinking about. So this is what I was hinting at earlier, where basically at the end of an episode, your AI companion could now come on, and you could have this. I would more generalize what you just said as a reflection session, and that might be different for everyone. For me, it's always this, I want to have this one single takeaway, which I like as a forcing function. But yeah, you just described a more elaborate version of that, combining it with what you've already listened to, where you could now continue to go deeper. A different way of looking at it is also often what I do is, if I come across an amazing episode, I talk to my friends about it. And usually that conversation sparks more insights and actually helps me identify what was actually most valuable. And we want to basically productize that and help you do that. Yeah, and again, automatically just at the end of an episode and not having to Sunday evening, 8 a.m. I need to do my 5 minutes of Snipd. Otherwise, again, my kids get kidnapped by the owl.
Yeah, the owl.
What was really interesting is your reframing of podcast content is a knowledge graph, right? And I'm sure, you mentioned that one of the biggest pain points is discovery. So that signals that the distribution follows the Pareto principle, right? Or maybe 90% of the ear time is monopolized by the top 5 to 10% of these long form creators. I'm just wondering, I'm addicted to TikTok, even though I don't want to, but I'm wondering, based on your, research of the user experience, is there a way where the design of the user experience in the short form world works in the long form world? So instead of a snip, it's a hook, right? It's a hook, because that's how I get hooked into podcast discoveries on TikToks. All these guys have hooks that are very resonant, very potent 30 seconds. And for me, as I go through my For You page, that's where I'm getting the snips or the hooks that then converts me into the long form content creation. Is that something that you were thinking about in terms of creating a FYP snip hook page for the users?
Yeah. So this is a very interesting field, because we actually have done a lot of experiments in this moment. In this field. So the short answer is yes. I think in the future we will have something like that. However, interestingly enough, we had something like that already and we removed it, and I'll tell you why. So basically, we had a For You feed with snips, and that was exactly the premise. You would listen to some great insights. It's the hook, and then you jump into the full episode. The problem is we did not have video. So for this to work, you really need video, because it's just the reality, our nature. We get bored super fast as humans if there's no input for our eyes. That's also why, we listen to podcasts while doing something else at the same time. So yeah, in the past we did not have video. And that is actually what we would like to do in the future, to add video to Snipd as well. And because we actually, the incredible thing is we have all of our users, they are creating these snips. These are the most interesting moments of all of these podcasts. And they are sharing them around. And it makes a lot of sense to surface them as a new way of discovering it. But we need video for that.
Hi, my name's Jose. I'm a native New Yorker. Building off the previous question, I confess that I'm actually one of the few people that doesn't bother with podcasts because of the discovery issue. One of my pain points is, I'm better off because when I read, I can actually search, is this useful to me? For the podcast, I have to usually listen through a good chunk before that's useful. So I was just curious too, what's being done to make that, for people to better assess what's useful, especially if they don't hear about it, because word of mouth is great, but not everybody has that. And then the other question I would like to ask is, what are we doing to integrate this into education? Because you do have kinesthetic, auditory, and visual learners, so the auditory would probably benefit from systematic podcasts.
Okay, maybe the first one. So basically, most of the features that I showed in the very beginning are geared towards helping you decide whether an episode is interesting for you or not. So in general, discovery and recommendations, I always like breaking them down into two phases. The one thing is you come across an episode through some recommendation algorithm, or some friend tells you about it, and then you now have this piece of content, and now the second phase is you deciding whether or not you will listen to it. Because it's not like TikTok where you just start, and then if you don't like it, you swipe away. You are committing yourself to a good chunk of time. What we're doing there today is basically the sneak peek that you can get a good overview. You can see how often this episode was snipped by others in the community. With the chapters, you can get an overview and jump into the moments that you like. But basically, for me, what I found the best thing here is the chat with episode, which, as I mentioned earlier, is not yet available for users before you started listening. But that is basically exactly that, where you mentioned with text you can skim through it, and with audio you can't, but with the chat you can actually, what are the core topics here? You can drill a bit deeper before deciding to listen.
And what models are you using on the back end?
We use various models. So we use OpenAI, we use various Google models, like the Gemini models, and we use Perplexity. And we have some things that we self-host. So it's really, a lot of different models. For us, it's often, we're working with a lot of, large context, a lot of text, a lot of input tokens in technical terms. So we have to be careful to use the right model to not have exploding costs. So that's often we think about, what's really the level of intelligence that we need, and based on that intelligence, we then select the right model to be able to offer that.
Yeah. More questions, lots of questions. Gentleman in the middle. Yeah.
Cool, thank you. My name is Jose. I was previously at Duolingo, so it's exciting to hear how y'all talk about this. I'm wondering about how you think about the interface challenge. You've talked a lot about how we're doing stuff with our eyes, and I find this a lot. It's great, I have snips, I can do all these things. I've been a user for 2 years, but if there's friction, I have to take out my phone. It's somewhere in my pocket. I'm in the subway. So how are you thinking about the interface challenge? And then Caleb, I think question for you is more how do you think about producing content when someone is trying to learn, but just on the go? So I think it's a two-pronged from a creator standpoint and then from a platform standpoint. The interface, I think, we have AirPods, that's great. Now we have AI, but I feel something tells me that there's something still missing at the core of how I interact with this.
Yeah, so one of the most important interaction paradigms that we have today is that if you want to create a snip, you do not have to take out your phone. So you can just triple tap your headphones and it will create a snip. Or if you're driving, you can use the skip back button on your steering wheel and it will create a snip. And that goes exactly back to what you were saying. For me personally, I always listen to podcasts when I ride my bike to work every day. And yeah, you don't want to get out your phone in that moment. And I think looking into the future, so this was already a big help, but there's a lot that now voice as an interface will enable in the future. How that might look like in the specifics, I think that's all still to be determined and to be discovered. Also depending on how hardware continues to evolve, what Apple is allowing us to do. That's a whole different other topic. And also if you look further enough in the future, I personally believe that smart glasses will become an important platform. And there again, voice as an interface will be an important thing. And final one, I think this actually ties back to what I was talking about earlier, where you have smart glasses on, and in the future, I believe it will be normal that you talk to them, even though you're in the subway and someone is next to you, and they will think you're crazy in the beginning. But it's just the same thing as if you're in the subway and you get a call, you pick up, and as long as you have reception, and you have that conversation, no one thinks you're crazy, right? Yeah.
And how do you think? Sorry, but to connect a couple of these things, how does your app change as maybe smart glasses is part of it, as podcasting becomes more of a visual medium, right? I mean, I feel like as a creator, all we hear about now is the rise of the video podcast. We know that YouTube is the largest platform for podcasting in the world. We know that 400 million hours a month of podcasts are streamed on TV sets on YouTube. So people are engaging with video podcasts in a sort of radically new way. And how does that layer into your app?
So I very much subscribe to the concept of backgroundable video. This is not something that I came up with. It was actually Gustav Söderström, the CPO of Spotify. I can recommend to listen to some podcasts of his. He's really great.
Yeah, share your snips.
So basically this concept of backgroundable video is that with a podcast you have video, and it helps a lot for what I was talking about earlier. Like, we get super bored if we don't have input for our eyes. It also helps the audience to engage with the hosts and guests on another level, because if I know how you look like, it's just I save it in a different part of my brain. But at the end of the day, the video is not the main thing that you're consuming. You are consuming the audio content. And YouTube is a good example. Like, even though you are streaming the video, a lot of people are still doing something else while they're consuming it, right? So you have, for example, on the laptop, you have Joe Rogan episode running, but yeah, you're cooking.
How dare you?
And so for me, like, smart glasses, there you won't have the video in the beginning. But yeah, it's just like a seamless thing. You're watching on your phone, but then you continue on your with your smart glasses, because these moments, as long as there are moments in your life where you're doing something with your eyes but not your brain, the need will continue to exist to have content for these moments.
So I love that we got so many questions. So let's keep going for questions if people are good for like another 10 minutes.
So what advice would you give to content creators to try to future-proof what you or whoever buys your company next will do?
So my personal recommendation, I think the most valuable thing that podcast creators have is the connection to the audience, like especially the host with the audience. I think it's much, much deeper than any other medium out there. And the loyalty that comes with that is very, very deep, which is also why I am very much interested much more in a future where, not a Perplexity, ChatGPT, where everything is AI generated and maybe it, got the information from your podcast. But no, I'm much more interested in, this is still your podcast, this is your brand, and the user might interact with it now in new ways on top of the old ways in the past. But yeah, to get back to my point, I think the most valuable thing, and that will remain in the future, is the connection with the host and this loyalty. I think that's a huge asset that you have.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Dajan. I write for a kids show on PBS, and a lot of educational media has been shifting to podcasts and just like sound affecting the hell out of it. So I do see the value in this as like a learning model as well for auditory learners. But in a previous life, I worked in ad sales intelligence and analytics. So I'm curious long term, what's your monetization strategy? Is it finding partners or to advertise by topics? And then Caleb, a question for you. How do you see this as being an advantage or disadvantage to how your current monetization is with your various current projects and future projects?
So the way that we monetize as of today is so it's a freemium app. So we have a premium version that our listeners pay for. This is the way that we monetize the app today. I think like in general, the monetization topic, I think is a bigger one, like as in monetization for the podcast creators as well. For them as well, yeah. Yeah. I think that's, let's put it like that. I think the way that it works today in podcasts, which actually not so many people know, like it's this dynamic ads system where dynamically ads get introduced into the audio file. This system, I mean, it's always been broken and it's always been crap, but I think in the future that is in danger, and we need a new way of doing it, I believe. How that might look like in general, in specifics, I can't tell you now. I think for me, one thing is that I think the ads model in general still makes sense to keep, but I think at the end of the day, the ads do have to shift more over to the platform side, actually. Like that doesn't mean that the creators, it can still be the creators that come up with the ads, etc., but they have to be natively somehow integrated into the platform. Like, already today, the truth is just that users, podcast listeners, they skip the ads. There are apps out there that already have, you can skip the first 5 minutes of a podcast and the last 5 minutes where most of the ads are. You have the skip 30-second button. Most people are using that. But in the future, there will be other providers out there who are not like us, who don't say, hey, we won't build an AI skip ad, like an ad blocker, basically. And then they're just all blocked. They're all gone. And yeah, if with AI advancing more and more, it would just become super, super easy. It would just be normal. So you have to then, the only solution that I see in the end is if it's natively incorporated in the app that basically forces the listener to listen to an ad, the same way as YouTube does.
Yeah, so sometimes for me as a listener of podcasts, as a consumer, I will, if they're partnered with I don't buy a mattress every week, but I might buy my groceries through whatever app, a Nature Box subscription or like a cereal subscription or something. I might buy 1 or 2 instances because I listen to Comedy Bang Bang say, hey, we use this as a partner, and we get a 10% kickback if you spend $50, they get $5 or $10, whatever. So of the creators you've worked with and partnered with, have any of them expressed a loss of that $5 to $10 income because it's such a quick ad that it's not included in the snip or someone may be introduced to that show itself?
So as of today, that it's not a problem on Snip because our users really, they do listen to the full episodes. That is what they love, and they create the snips to capture the information and do more with it. And then they might share it with someone, and then you might listen to 1 or 2 snips here and there. But the 99% of people listening is to full episodes. Or we do not live in this world yet where you can just automatically skip all of the ads. But what I'm saying is this is inevitable. If someone will do it.
Thanks for not building that feature.
Yeah, because the inverse of the sort of quick summary at the end is you just get onto the app and it says, hey, welcome back. Let me just summarize, 10 shows for you. And then if you want to, basically your micro podcasting vision, which is interesting. So more questions. Gosh. You want to do, sorry, let's go this way. Okay, go ahead.
Hey, is this on? So I was a little bit concerned because you're creating such a wonderful app. I use it every day. But it's kind of a meta layer on top of other podcasts. And just like Craigslist kind of sucked the money out of classified advertising and it eviscerated basically the very valuable news industry. Do you feel that you're kind of putting a layer on top that's, once you start charging or putting ads in your kind of podcast meta layer, all the people who are actually creating the content kind of, the money gets sucked out of the ecosystem to the metadata layer on top of it. Just like, the news companies are fighting in Europe to avoid Google News. So, ultimately, are you creating another action or are you just motivating more consumers? So people watch podcasts, but what do they do? And are you helping the content creators to actually make money, or are you basically, putting a layer on top of them?
Yeah. So as of today, I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier as well. As of today, I don't think we're taking away anything from anyone. But and your question, are we? Or let me formulate it differently. I'm envisioning a future where we are helping creators make more money. But I think it will, we will have to come together and create something together to create this. Because otherwise it doesn't work. I mean, it's just...
if you look across the podcast ecosystem today, right, vast majority of people watch on YouTube, which is the biggest one, Apple, Google, Spotify, Amazon, it's all these big guys, right? And so once you get to the sort of Snipd and the sort of more indie power user podcast apps, we're talking about it's probably 10% of the podcast listeners. So it really is the hardcore listeners. And I think that the sort of journey that at least I see us going through is that the hardcore, sort of more, at the apps like Snipd, who are really exploring the frontier edge of this, will start to introduce features and functionality over time that will probably have some of the key creators will say, hey, I want to have this sort of premium feature, which is going to allow people to talk to the library and things like that. And that will start to happen. And so that's sort of my hope. It's very early days, and I think that the power right now really lies on the big platform side. It's like, what does Spotify do with this? And how did they, So let's keep going with questions. This gentleman here, either one of you, go. Either one.
Thanks for coming out. I know you've been talking a lot about the host relationship with you guys at Scribd. Do you have any partnership with or dashboard? Because I know hosts are kind of data starved for engagement metrics and everything. So I was wondering, I assume the SNPs are good indicators of engagement and engaging topics. So I wonder if you expose any of that or other programs with the actual hosts.
Today, no. So far, we've really tried to be 100% focused on the podcast listener. Just because, we're a small team, we're 4 people. But that's something that we want to do. I think the SNPs is very valuable. I mean, what you can already do is you can go to the app and you can see how often an episode was snipped. But this more fine, granular information, we don't yet offer to creators.
And I'll tell you, when Kevin came here last week and we met, we talked about doing a subsection of this event tonight with creators. Because I knew that there would be, a bunch of people who've spoken up here are creators, and so we knew there'll be a few creators in the room. felt like it was a little bit early. But I mean, I think that that would be a compelling thing, at least a starting point for creators to be verified. Make sure it's really the creator, and then to give them sort of data, because you guys have a lot of interesting data. Let's move to this gentleman here, I think.
Hi, my name is Shashank. First of all, big user of your app, really love it. One question that I do have is that, so you're based out of Zurich or Switzerland somewhere?
Yes.
Okay, so do you have any kind of like, if you were to do like a 90-second spiel on like what it's like starting a startup in Europe specifically? The reason I ask is because you were talking about moving into potentially doing interstitial ads on the platform level in your app, which makes a lot of sense the way YouTube does it, right? And I work for one of the large video platform companies that was mentioned earlier today, and over half the revenue, or a very large section of the revenue, is generated from just USCA. Do you see that there is any value in potentially starting up a small office in the States as well in order to capture that market at all, or do you think you can capture it from the US or from Europe?
So already today, the US is our largest market and most important market. I mean, that's the beauty of starting let's just call it an internet business, right? I mean, we have customers in more than, I think, well, the last time I checked, it was 149 countries where we have paying customers. I need to check again because I really want to have that 150. and users in, I think, more than 210 countries. Which I think I was told is more countries than Coca-Cola is in. So it's possible to do that also from Switzerland. But there are definitely differences. Zurich in particular is a very interesting place for AI, driven by ETH. It's one of the best tech universities in the world. That's basically also the reason why. So Google has the biggest tech hub outside of the US in Zurich. Facebook has built a huge team doing reality lab stuff, so a lot of AI. Apple has a secret AI team there. OpenAI and Anthropic just announced that they're coming to Zurich. So for AI, it's a very interesting place to be. But yeah, I think at some point we should also have an office in the US.
Okay, gentleman in the back.
Hi, I want to get back to the future-proofing yourself as a podcaster thing that just came up a second ago. So my background is a mix of linear radio. I used to produce Morning Edition at WNYC here in New York, and then I got into tech. Today I host a podcast called Crafted, where I interview a lot of founders like yourself. And I'm interested in how all of these trends will change what kind of podcast people produce in the first place. Like, for example, on my show, I usually interview someone for 60 to 90 minutes, then I cut it down to about 25 minutes. There's a little bit of sound design, and I don't know if that's, and I'm cutting stuff that's like interesting, but I still, maybe because I grew up in linear radio, I still think of it as a linear show, and I want the show to like sound good from beginning to end. But with all the ways that we're talking about it being atomized, people talking to the show, I don't know if that's even smart of me to keep doing. You mentioned Lenny's podcast earlier. I find his show to be way too long, but I don't think he thinks of it as a show. I think he thinks of it as like, let me get lots of 5-minute chunks that are going to get shared. I don't know that. I haven't talked to him. He hasn't told me that, but that's my sense of it. And just another like small example. Video just came up, and to put the show on video and audio, like a really small thing is like taking out ums. It's really easy to do with audio, but with video you see lots of jump cuts. Right, and so it just changes what you produce in the first place. So I'm interested in all of your takes on, what kind of how this changes what people produce in the first place.
So, I think at the end of the day, it's a bit a question who your audience is, right? Who are you creating content for, or what's like the primary user that you're creating it for? Is it the person who's doing something else at the same time, basically primarily consuming it with audio, or are you creating for a person who wants to watch it in front of the TV? I mean, that's your decision to take. But let's say you are creating content for someone who is primarily consuming it via audio. I think it's still the best thing to do is just to create a piece of content that is most entertaining. I don't think that long-form audio will go away. I think we talked a lot about like being able to talk and atomizing and everything, but I don't see long-form audio going away, especially once you are really in a conversation, like you're listening to a conversation, and as long as it is engaging, because you have cut out like the boring stuff, people will continue to listen. And the ability to talk to it in that case might just be, hey, there's something interesting that pops up and you want to know more and want to deep dive or something like that. But I think that's still the right way of approaching it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a medium that's in constant flux, right? I mean, 5 years ago, people thought that the great thing about podcasting is you can do a limited series that's going to be 10 episodes and beautifully sound designed, and that has completely shifted. If you had told me 5 years ago that like 50 of the top 100 podcasts were going to be people talking for 4 hours, I would have told you were crazy, because it was such a handcrafted and artisanal medium. And I think it's exciting that it's shifting in that way. I think it's exciting that it's shifting longer. I think it's exciting that the New York Times is experimenting with even shorter form content. Like, I don't know. I think the medium continues to evolve, and I do think that like it's about harnessing that parasocial relationship between audience and host. And some people love a parasocial relationship that's 20 minutes long, and some people love a parasocial relationship that's 4 hours long. But it's about taking advantage of that. It is about creating some kind of arc within whatever you're making, whether what you're making is, look at a show like Acquired, right? Those episodes are incredibly long, but riveting, because new shit's happening. So I don't know. I'm less worried about, like, I think creators will find interesting ways to solve these problems. And frankly, as someone who spends a lot of time manually cutting ums and ahs out of tape, if people don't care about that as much, I don't know, maybe that's liberating.
Okay, I think on that note, we should call it to an end. So thank you, both of you. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Caleb. Thank you all for coming.